podcast of the PPO, podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.
Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Public Procurement Office podcast. Today I will speak with very special guest coming from United States of America, Mr. Professor Christopher Yukins. Christopher, could you please introduce yourself and tell us how you actually got into the public procurement?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. It's an extraordinary opportunity and privilege to be able to come here to Slovakia to talk to you all about public procurement. I really got into public procurement because I wanted to have an opportunity to work in a field where I would be able to work in public policy and business issues and law issues all combined. Oftentimes the joke among Americans working in my field is they often say, well, I just fell into procurement. And it wasn't really the case for me. The case for me, I had a senior colleague said, look, you can do this, and if you do this, you get to work in many different spheres at the same time, and also make our country a better place and make the world a better place. So it was a real opportunity for me. I was very, very glad I had the opportunity. I was very lucky. Also, what has changed, what's happening in public procurement is, and the reason I'm in Slovakia, we're having the conference, is that procurement is becoming truly global very rapidly. So I happen to be lucky enough to be living in a time in history when the discipline is really exploding globally. And that's a privilege as well.
And what do you think are the differences between American procurement and European procurement?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I would say that the American procurement market at the federal level at the federal government is about $800 billion a year. So let's say roughly 700 billion euros a year at current exchange rates. And as an example of how it's different at the state and local level, we think it's about the same size, but we're really not sure because there's no transparency at the state and local level. So one important difference is that whereas European procurement is very well vertically organized from the national level through the provincial level to the local level, the legal structures and the transparency requirements are very clear vertically in the European Union. In the United States, that's not true. And as a result, state and local procurement can often be dominated by local concerns or local power structures. It's different in that way.
Does it mean that maybe not all the contracting authorities are mandatory to use public procurement processes? Very often they are mandated, but there aren't effective relief systems if they break the rules. That's a big problem. And the rules can be, for instance, the state where I live, Delaware, has no procurement regulations at all. It has statutes, but it has no regulations, and it then relies on guidance and goodwill. That works okay in Delaware because it's generally a pretty clean state, but you can imagine if you had a corrupt state, and we do have some corrupt states, that's very dangerous to have a structure like that. So it's much more the Wild West in America. So it's really possible right now in America that, for example, I'm a mayor in Delaware, and I am just giving the tender to some company directly without any selection process, with selection criteria, with, the green requirement, social requirement, or the lowest price requirement. I just simply choose this company, they will give me offer, and I can sign contract.
In practice, that can happen. And actually, the flip of the legal structure is even tragically more common, which is that because there are no regulations, all you have is statute. So, for example, there was a prominent politician where I live, in Delaware, and she was the state auditor, and she engaged in contract splitting, which means breaking up a contract to stay below a threshold. She did that just out of her own convenience. But because there was no regulation, there was only a statute making it a criminal offense, she was criminally prosecuted for splitting, which is something that occurs all the time. She was successfully criminally prosecuted for contract splitting, which never would occur in a mature system. It's ridiculous. It's saying, well, if the threshold is $1 million and you break a contract into two, so it's $500,000 and $500,000, then that's called contract splitting. It happens all the time. People do it all the time. But she was criminally prosecuted because we don't have a mature legal system. So to answer your question, it's at the state and local level, less rigorously organized. At the federal level, it is more mature, much more mature, and there's a very strong sense. I would argue that one difference between European procurement and U.S. procurement at the federal level is very clearly at the federal level, procurement is mission-driven. That we train students for both lawyers and contracts professionals and the mid-career contracts professionals, somebody who, for example, worked for a military agency. They clearly understand that their mission is to buy the best possible weapon system. And they're willing to break rules in order to do that, to get the best possible weapon system. And so that sense of mission drives it and has very important ramifications in the system. Well, here sometimes the procurement professionals can be more bureaucratic. Well, in the United States, they're very, very mission-driven, at their best. Sometimes they're bureaucratic as well, but at their best, they're very mission-driven. It creates an interesting tension.
And what is interesting also that, for example, in our country, when you are talking about defense, actually they have so many exemptions from the law that, to be honest, I know probably the least about the procurement regarding the defense or weapon buying, because it is top secret. I totally understand. They say it is for the protection of the country's, the country protection. But we cannot evaluate it that well.
Yeah, that actually was an issue that came up when I worked for 10 years on the United Nations Model Procurement Law, and in the Model Procurement Law for the United Nations was, in the 2012 version, it converged civilian and defense procurement. And so while we were debating that around 2006, 2008, many of the, especially Latin American, like the Bolivian government, was leftist at that point, and they said, well, you from the U.S., you want to converge defense procurement with civilian procurement just to create opportunities for American weapons manufacturers. And that was offensive, but we couldn't really respond to that argument because it was so directed at us as a country. But what happened was very interesting. Was the Western African nations stood up literally stood up in a UN hall, and they said, "No, we think this is a good idea." And they had exactly the same perspective you did. They said, "We've been told for decades now that we can't see defense procurement. It's a black box, because it has to be protected for national security purposes," and that's created a lot of corruption in West Africa. We don't think that that's a good idea. We think that the civilian and defense procurement systems should be merged. And, the Americans have been doing this since 1984. So it's a good idea to have at least the rule systems merged together. And we said, yeah, they're exactly right. So it was a very interesting coalition between the U.S. delegation and these Western African nations, and we ultimately were able to do it. And the UN Model Procurement Law deals with civilian and defense procurement on an integrated basis. In the United States, I should point out that the intelligence community is separate. The intelligence community is a black box, but that's probably only one huge scandal away from transparency. The intelligence community claims that it has to be absolutely non-transparent. It's probably somewhere between $80 and $100 billion in procurement just with regards to what's known of what the intelligence community does, but nobody really knows exactly how much is going on.
Intelligence communities, you mean like the organizations that are working for the government?
Yeah. That would be the intelligence organizations, would be the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. They all they fall under an umbrella that we call the intelligence community. And there it's a black box. But many Americans, myself included, believe that somewhere in the future there will be a scandal. Something will go wrong in intelligence procurement, and the intelligence procurement world will be opened up, much as the defense world is opened up. The defense world is presumptively transparent. It is non-transparent. So, for example, I worked for 20 years with a body armor manufacturer, and everything that the body armor manufacturer did was transparent. I could see the contracts. Everything was transparent. I didn't have a security clearance after I left the government, but that was okay. The only thing that was not transparent was the ballistic requirements. That would be how thick the body armor had to be to keep a bullet from penetrating it. And that's a national security secret, because if you know that information, then the enemy will design their attack to penetrate the bullet.
So I cannot ask you now because but it differs. I understand you just exactly that it might be different. Yeah.
It was only, but the point is that 99% of the contracting about my client was transparent. 1% was secret, which was this ballistic information, but it was done just mechanically. They would have a secret addendum to the contract, would say, okay, this is how strong the body armor had to be. But by and large, everything was transparent, and it worked just fine. So that the reality is, if you go from where Slovakia is today, where you have this black bar called defense contracting, to where the United States is today, where defense contracting is generally very transparent, it really is not a shock to the system. It works okay.
I wanted to ask you, can you tell me then what are the principles or the rules that they actually apply in general on how to choose the contracting authority, how they actually choose the winner of the tender?
That's a very good question, and I should say that more and more of my work as a professor is involved in this area. So I'll be taking the Delaware bar. I now live in the state of Delaware next spring, and then I have to, which is completely crazy, I have to do a 3-month internship. So basically, as a 60-something-year-old man, I'm going to be doing a 3-month internship like a student. And I'm going to do the internship in the state procurement office to learn more about it. So to answer your question, it depends on the size of the procurement. I want to draw a comparison between the largest state procurements and the European procurements. European procurements are oftentimes awarded on a points basis, and it's felt that it's an objective and a good way to do it. I have to disagree with that, and that's because the goal in a complex procurement, if you're buying a information technology system, you're buying healthcare services, whatever it is, if you're buying a complex system, the government shouldn't design the system. It should be a private company that's really immersed in the technology. They should be designing the system because they're going to be smarter. They're going to be better at it. The point system that's used at the state and local level and used very commonly here in Europe, the point system is basically the government designing the system, because the government's saying we're going to give more points to red cars than blue cars. And so the red car provider wins the contract because they get more points. Well, the government doesn't always know if, in fact, red cars are better than blue cars. So by making a priori decision, a decision ahead of time, that red cars are better, we're going to give them more points, the government has taken over the design process. Not a good idea. I was teaching in Argentina, and I was teaching. There was a young man from Buenos Aires, and he bought ambulances. And I said, "So how do you decide whom to award the contract to?" He says, "We always award low price, sir." I said, "Well, that's fantastic." I said, "Well, how do you write the specifications for the ambulances?" I said, "Do you have any experience in the ambulance industry?" "Oh, no, sir. No, sir." I said, "You're a young man. Have you ever ridden in an ambulance?" No, sir. I said, "Well, where do you get the specifications?" He said, "From the fellow in the next office. He gives me the specifications." I said, "Well, how do you know you're getting the best technology?" He said, "I really don't." He really doesn't. As opposed to when you and I, for example, when we go buy a car, we go and when we buy the car, we have a blank slate. We go to different salespeople and we say, "Tell us why your car is better." And then you're going from salesman to salesman to salesman, gathering information. You've let the car companies design the best solution, and then you're letting the salesman or saleswoman tell you, hopefully, the truth about what the best product is. It's a completely different way of approaching the market.
And very subjective.
Very subjective. And that means that my joke is that when my wife and I buy a car, she's definitely the boss. And so if I buy a car she doesn't like, I'm accountable. I'm going to get in deep trouble. So in our system, when we have a very subjective system, the secret is having a very accountable official. So typically it'll be in a military procurement, for example, it'll be a general officer. And he or she is accountable for the decision. If they buy the wrong weapon system, that will hurt their career. They are accountable for that decision.
Okay, and how can I protect myself if I'm the unsuccess offer? Because here, of course, we have all these systems, so that we are always trying to be as objective as possible. So what happens in the United States if, for example, I'm the unsuccessful one, but I disagree?
So that's a very interesting question. So let's take, for example, the Air Force procurement. And Air Force procurements, they're not done by points anymore. They're done by colors. And the Air Force system their uniforms are blue. So the best you can get in an evaluation is blue. So you'll have 10 elements to evaluation. If you get lots of blues, then you win. The Air Force, in sort of a half joke, they want to make fun of the Army. The Army uniforms are green, so a bad color is green. So if you get all green, you lose the Air Force procurement. And you, as an outside observer, you would go to that, you say, wait a minute, you're making an award based on lots of blues versus not. It sounds completely crazy. And it is very, very difficult for, as you point out, for the competitor to challenge it. I think that what will happen is as information systems as the data gets more sophisticated, we won't rely on this. 20 years from now, people will laugh. Wait, you made an award based on lots of blues and no greens? That's crazy. You'll get more data feeding into the evaluation process, but at the end of the day, it should remain subjective. Because what happens is, this is kind of the secret buried within the procurement process, that when you and I go, when we buy a car, we're learning. We're learning all the time. Like when my wife and I went and bought a car a few years ago, we got reverse cameras. My wife is a terrible parker. I had no idea that you could get reverse camera. It changed my wife's life. It changed our marriage. Our marriage survived because now she has a reverse camera. And I didn't know that, but I was learning it during the acquisition process. So if I'd written specifications ahead of time that didn't take that into account, I would have bought the wrong car. I was learning during the procurement process. So yes, it's a highly subjective process. It's very subjective when I'm buying a car. I identified the car with a reverse camera, and I bought it because it would make things easier for my wife parking. But that subjectivity was essential because it allowed the learning process to continue during the acquisition. That the acquisition, and when you're buying something complex, if you're buying, for example, this sound studio, if you're buying something that's complex, by definition, the purchaser is taking on information very rapidly, and you have to leave the space for the purchaser to be able to take that information on, make, yes, a subjective decision, but really buy best value, and then be accountable for it.
Well, how would you say politics influence procurement processes or principles or missions in United States?
So that's it. So one of the interesting things about it is that corruption in procurement creates a brain drain that people will so for example, I grew up in Massachusetts, which is notoriously corrupt. And I grew up knowing that if I wanted to work in public policy, ultimately I want to work in procurement, I would have to leave Massachusetts. That's why I went to Washington. And Washington is a cleaner government. So to answer your question, where you have corruption in procurement, it exacerbates existing corruption problems, and those corruption problems then create dislocation in our society. You create a brain drain. I met my wife when I was in Michigan. I went to work in Michigan, and it was so wonderful. I could finally work in a clean state, and that was, for me, that was really a big change. Because when I was growing up, the residue or the problems that were left over from Catholic immigration from Eastern Europe. My great-grandfather, for example, was Lithuanian. The social tensions that had created a foundation for corruption was still there. There's very much a sense among Catholic politicians, we finally made it, we have our share, and now we want to grab as much as we can. And that created a system that was not stable. And so to answer your question, the corruption creates an unstable system. At the federal level, politics in the Trump administration politics are interesting because President Trump is very much a personal ruler. He's a populist ruler. Everything revolves around President Trump, and so he has issued edicts, for example, to rewrite the regulations. But the impact has been muted because he issues edicts that have to go through a very dense bureaucracy. I mean, there are 100,000 people who work in federal procurement in Washington, D.C. So it's a very, very dense community. What hasn't happened is we haven't yet had a major crisis. So what we're waiting for is, for example, that President Trump has said that he is the ultimate arbiter. He is the ultimate voice on issues of law, on questions of law in the government, which for the United States, it's a revolutionary concept. The idea that the president can decide all questions of law, because there are all these courts and boards and there are all these systems set up so that the questions of law are decided independently of the president.
Exactly. Is this even legal, what he's saying?
It hasn't been challenged successfully yet, but the crisis could arise, for example, if he's very sensitive to Boeing's production of the next generation of his aircraft, the Air Force One, that's a presidential aircraft. If he were to get upset with Boeing and there were a contract dispute about the production, and then he were to order the judges, the administrative judges, to rule in a certain way, the whole system would start to unravel. That would be very disruptive, but there are safeties for that as well. So that they had the problem, for example, in Latin American countries where they felt the procurement was too political. So the disputes process moved outside the government, and it's not uncommon in some Latin American countries to have arbitration. So you move the disputes process. Once the procurement disputes process becomes too political, you move it offshore. You move it into an arbitration system. So we've anticipated the problem and we anticipated the solution, but thank God we haven't had the problem yet.
It is very interesting for me when I learned that actually United States is really kind of, I don't want to say closed market, but is the market who is definitely not open to other suppliers as is European market, where up till now it was open for everybody with almost equal chances. We can see that Europe is now changing this direction, is trying to protect more the European market. When you look at the United States, you always did this. So what do you think? What is the better approach?
So in many ways, and that's been the focus of our conference over the last couple of days. One interesting thing is that the Buy American Act was passed in 1933. It was actually signed on the very last day in government by the predecessor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And at that point, American presidents didn't change in January, they changed in March.
So you have this Buy American principle since that time? Since
1933, and it was passed shortly after a series of tariffs called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And the consensus is that the focus wasn't on the Buy American Act, but the focus is on those tariffs that came a little bit later, came after the crash of '29, before the Buy American Act in 1933, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And the Smoot-Hawley tariffs are broadly blamed for making the Depression worse, So the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and the Buy American Act are sort of a bundle of unpopular policies. And by the end of the 20th century, by the 1990s and early 2000s, really the consensus was, it had none. So we had the Buy American Act was a sweeping requirement. It had been narrowed by President Eisenhower. And so in a series of measures and international agreements, by the end of the 20th century, we had really narrowed our protectionism down at the federal government level to really just security of supply, which is in the case of a war or in the case of a national crisis like the COVID-19 crisis, that under principles of security of supply, we would have access. We could exclude vendors, for example, if we wanted to make sure that we have a domestic supply of personal protective equipment. That's a national security issue, and so we could exclude vendors. So we had narrowed, before Trump won, we had narrowed our policy making down to security of supply. There were still old laws in the book, but the consensus among Americans who were running the procurement system was that having these barriers in place is not... Remember, when you buy something based on a domestic preference, when you buy something based on a Buy American preference or a Buy European preference, by definition, you're not buying the best product. Because if the European product for here is the best product, you don't have to worry about a preference. You just buy the European product. You only have to worry about a preference when you're buying the not best product. And so by the late 20th century, early 21st century, we had really understood that we're going to narrow it down to just security of supply. And I'm immersed in the community. So my former students, for example, are the lobbyists working in this area. Nobody had any contest when the lobbyists in favor of U.S. industry were making their arguments. It was around security of supply. But then Trump won, and Biden blew that all open. And now it is, Buy American is fashionable again. At least it was when Trump won. And for Biden, it was very important as well. Biden was responding to Trump. Biden anticipated running against Trump. So he wanted to be as nationalistic, Buy American as possible. And you can see that in the Biden administration. What's been very interesting during the Trump 2 administration, though, is that President Trump has really not focused on Buy American at all. There was some initial talk about it very early in the administration. There was a memo issued, and then there was a report issued in April 2025. But it's been very, very muted. And the advisor who's focused on this, Peter Navarro, has really been below the waves. You really have not seen Peter Navarro. Instead, Trump 2.0 has focused on tariffs. And I think that you can explain that because Trump 1.0 was about Buy American because Trump wanted political power, he wanted electoral power, and Buy American gave him that electoral power. In Trump 2.0, he wants personal power. And Buy American really doesn't create personal power for him, but tariffs create tremendous personal power, tremendous personal leverage for President Trump.
We will definitely talk about tariffs also later, but firstly, I would like to see the real example. How does Buy American truly look like? Because I don't know the exact definition. I cannot imagine if it's American products. What does it mean, American products? Or how do you actually, in the real life, what is Buy American?
So I'm going to give you a couple of. It's incredibly complex, and so one of the jokes among lawyers working in my field is somebody asks you a Buy American Act question. Don't respond without doing the research. It's so complex. It's like a Byzantine law. But I can give you a couple quick insights. So first of all, if you look at it just in buying supplies. Up to $10,000, there's no constraints. So if a Slovakian company wanted to export to the United States and they could sell supplies below $10,000, they should. For example, they could do it through Amazon into the government. So if they're selling a certain kind of supply, like the glass we have in front of us here, then they should sell it below $10,000 through Amazon. It's basically a free zone up to $10,000. From $10,000 to approximately $200,000 is where the Buy American Act applies. So from a European perspective, all I ever hear from my European colleagues is Buy American Act, Buy American Act, Buy American Act. But in fact, the Buy American Act only applies up to $200,000. And this is a pretty big, robust system. There are no contracts below $200,000. And once you go above $200,000, then the trade agreements take effect. And the trade agreements, like the government procurement agreement, open the market to European vendors. So the Buy American Act has a very, very tiny impact on the system. And this is the funny part, remember I told you I have contracting officers in my class. And so the law students are listening there, they're learning the laws. And then I turn to the contracting officials and I say, guys, you're experienced contracting officials. Applying the Buy American Act, which requires you to assess the value of components, is really complicated, right? And they all nod, yes, professor, that's right, they're really complicated. I said, have you ever written a contract so it's below $200,000 and you fall into the Buy American Act? Or do you always write the contract for a higher level? Or use a framework agreement to carry you into a higher level? And they'll say, oh yeah, professor, absolutely.
Intentionally.
Intentionally. They never, ever, ever fall into the zone of the Buy American Act because it's so hard to apply. You have to assess the cost of the components. It's very, very difficult to apply. So I have never seen a Buy American contract. My students never have, because nobody wants to be in that zone. Instead, they want to be at a higher zone above $200,000, which is in fact open to European exporters.
And this is exactly why I asked you about this, because we know now there are these talks about the European products. But if I have this question, what is European product? Nobody knows. Of course, it's only in the process making, but I can also totally imagine it is so hard to define. When will the product really become European? When it is produced in Europe, when it is like put together in Europe, when it is labeled or whatever done in Europe, it is very difficult.
So let me give you an example of how crazy it gets when you actually, you're right, it is very, very difficult. And by the way, so what's interesting about these discussions, and I've tried to convey this to my colleagues, they all say, well, the standard will be if it's substantially transformed in the European Union. And I say, well, that's only a starting point. There are actually three questions you have to answer. What's the standard? That's the what, okay? The second question is the who. Who is going to make the decision? Is it a contracting official? Is it a central office? You have to decide that. And if it's going to, in our system, usually it's a contracting official. So a vendor will try to find the stupidest contracting official, persuade the stupidest contracting official that in fact is made in America, and then take that certificate around to other smarter contracting officials and say, well, look, it's already been decided. And the third is you have to decide what the enforcement mechanism, what the teeth will be. In our system, we have a very aggressive anti-fraud law. That's the teeth. And that anti-fraud law really makes contractors pay attention. But in Europe, you don't have that. You don't have that teeth, those teeth. And those are the three questions. But to your point about how hard it is to implement, so early on in his administration, as part of the Build America, Buy America Act, as the legislation was rolling forward, President Biden made a speech in which he said, when you walk out, this is a State of the Union address, he said, when you walk out onto a bridge, I want you to know that everything in that bridge, all the construction materials are made in America. So he had set this benchmark for construction materials, but the regulations that were issued under the Act then defined construction materials to cover only 6 or 7 categories. We began to think that they wrote the definition of construction materials to match his speech, that whatever in a bridge is going to be what's defined, because it was very narrowly defined. And then it was defined differently than construction materials under the Buy American Act. This is the 1933 Act. So old Professor Yukins, the Biden administration, they had an open forum where you could call in and you could provide comments. And they said, very strictly, you can only speak for 3 minutes. And I said, okay. So I wrote my speech out very carefully. And they said, okay, we're going to open the floor now. Professor Yukins, you make the first comment. So I spoke for 2 minutes and 50 seconds. I was completely professional, on point, told them how crazy it was to have 2 definitions that conflict with each other. What's a construction material? I don't know. This could be under the Buy America. I don't know. It's all confusing. So we got to the end of the 3 minutes. He said, thank you very much, Professor. And they said, anybody else want to comment? And I wasn't alone on the line. There were very sophisticated procurement people. There were lobbyists for construction industries. There were very sophisticated people on that call. We get to 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 seconds, and it's silence. Absolute silence. And I thought, why is old Professor Yukins the only one making any comments? I feel kind of silly, but okay. So we had just silence, 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 silence. And eventually the White House people just shut off the call. They said, no more comments, that's it. We're just going to rest with Professor Yukins' comments. And I thought, wow, why did this happen? Why did they not say the obvious, which is this is a crazy regulatory structure with these conflicts? And it dawned on me over time that industry liked the confusion. They liked the conflict between the definitions because it makes it more difficult for the teeth to bite. It's more difficult for someone to bring a fraud action for a government agency, or an individual could bring a fraud action. It's more difficult for the teeth to bite if the law is confusing. So they actually liked the confusion of the law. And I realized how foolish I was to be, such a eager beaver to make these comments over the 3 minutes, because others who were more thoughtful, they thought from an industry perspective, they liked the confusion. So it answers your question. If I could go on for days and days talking about the various rules, But I hope these examples show you that in implementation, because politics invades the law, in implementation, it's incredibly complex, and it's very confusing for industry.
This was a very strong statement that politics involves the law. I totally agree. But how did this actually? How did it finish? Because what was the result? How then it was made in USA?
The result was that the regulations do conflict, and the compliance system. You have to the backdrop to all this is that American companies have very sophisticated compliance systems in place. They're multinationals. If you have Bechtel, for example, is working in Poland. This American company will have very sophisticated compliance systems where they try to sort this out. Okay, if we have to meet a contract that requires construction materials, how are we going to resolve this? And the answer is it's going to be specific to the contract. They're going to make it plain to the customer that it's confusing, and so they're having a hard time complying, so that the customer or a whistleblower can't bring a fraud lawsuit. They'll make it all very plain. So the answer to your question is the confusion makes it much more difficult for the government to enforce these domestic preferences. And my concern is the same thing will happen in Europe.
That comes my next question, because very often I hear that United States are much more result-oriented, whereas Europe is much more process-oriented. It is visible now, especially after Corona. We can really see that Europe is still sticking to their processes. What do you think? Is this really beneficial for the Europe now when you look at it from a little bit far?
That's a different question, and it's a good question. It's an important question. What happened? So we were, as a community. Let me tell you what happened in 9/11. Maybe that's maybe that'll answer your question more clearly. And my mother was German, and I have German relatives, and I talked with them a lot about this because it was so striking how the cultural differences was. On the morning of September 11th, we were in Washington. We could see I was about 12 or 15 kilometers from the Pentagon, and you could see the smoke coming out of the Pentagon. And so we knew right away that there would be massive casualties. We thought there would be massive casualties. Ultimately, there weren't, because the plane that struck the Pentagon struck a Pentagon that had been reinforced. That wedge of the Pentagon had been reinforced in construction, so all the people on the plane died, but there were relatively few casualties inside the Pentagon itself because it had been reinforced. But we didn't know that, so we could see the Pentagon burning, and so the individual Americans. So I called my family, made sure that my wife and my kids were okay. The Americans, so they addressed their family first, and then they turned to the community. So when I was driving along the highway, I knew there was a hospital and an exit, so I pulled over so I could give blood for the casualties. And when I got to the blood donation center, it was like a rugby game times 1,000. There were like hundreds of people pushing to get in. And so that's, to answer your question, the Americans who are mission-oriented or community-oriented, they'll act very quickly to resolve a problem. And the same thing happened during the pandemic, during COVID, that Americans were trying to solve problems very quickly. We had a student who was in charge of. He runs an investment firm, but he's a former Army Ranger. He spent 10 years in very, very dangerous combat situations. He's a very practiced professional, very practiced former military professional as well. And his job was to go out and negotiate not body bags, but the racks on which you would put dead bodies, because the city of New York couldn't get racks fast enough. And so he took Rockefeller Foundation money. The Rockefeller Foundation poured money in, and he took the money and he went out and negotiated. He also had to negotiate for masks with minor criminals in Long Island, mafioso, basically, who had gotten masks. And he took pictures of them, and we had him in a webinar, and he said, "You may not believe me that they're mafioso." And I said, "No, look in the photograph. If you look at the shoes, those are mafia shoes." They're wearing mafia shoes. His name is Tommy Hendricks. And we had a webinar, and people said, so Europeans were saying, what is this use of private money, use of Rockefeller Foundation money to solve a public problem? This is very weird. And I said, no, it's not for us. It's for us as part of our tradition. When you have a public crisis, private people, the Rockefeller Foundation will pour money in very quickly to solve the problem. New York City has been doing this since the 1600s. If you look back to the history, they've been doing it in the 1600s. So to answer your question, the difference in culture allows Americans to move more quickly to try to solve a public policy problem, to try to solve a public crisis. And I think that's a very valuable instinct in the culture, and sometimes it should be treasured. It's something that should be treasured.
Let's go now to the tariffs. So as we discussed a little bit before, President Trump is using this as a very powerful tool. He is very unpredictable, as we all know. How is this affecting procurement or all this economical situation in the public procurement processes?
So that's a layered question, and it opens up opportunities potentially for European vendors as well. Let me explain. So at the federal level, the Defense Department, about a half to 2/3 of our procurement is Defense Department procurement. It's defense material, defense services, and the Defense Department has a very well established exception from tariffs, and that regulatory exception was supported by the Senate Armed Services Committee. They wanted to take the regulatory exception and make it statutory, make it part of the law. The Trump administration got very angry. The White House issued a scathing attack saying, no, tariffs are part of President Trump's plan to bring industrial America back, which is crazy in itself. But we want to bring back industrial America. So we don't think that this legal change makes sense. So the Senate receded, but the exception is still in the regulations. It's been there since the 1990s. It's there now. Now that the regulations are being revised under Trump, it's still there. The exception is still there. So in the federal level, the Defense Department has a very clear exception. So if a European exporter, a Slovak company, for example, is exporting into the Defense Department, if they follow the right process, they'll be exempt from the tariffs. And the reason for that is pretty simple, which is that policymakers didn't want, with a 10% baseline tariff, and sometimes higher, oftentimes higher, it meant that the warfighting capacity of the Defense Department was being reduced by 10%. You buy 10% less weapons and services. And again, I emphasize that ours is a mission-focused society. So in a society where you're undercutting your ability to fight war, or your ability to defend. For example, if a European company has a defensive technology like minesweeping, if we need minesweeping is focused here now in Europe. So if we want to have minesweepers available for the Strait of Hormuz, you don't want a situation where you're getting 10% fewer minesweepers. So that's at the federal level, it's resolved. At the state and local level, not so much. It's not really clear how state and local governments, and remember, we're guessing that state and local procurement is about the same size as federal procurement, about 700 or so billion euros. The state and local governments were very upset because they have much smaller budgets, and they were very upset by the tariffs. There was a thought of using framework agreements, national framework agreements that are run through a national consortium of state procurement officers. It's called the National Association of State Procurement Officials, NASPO. They have these vehicles, these framework agreements that state and local and tribal governments can buy from. And so the thought was that, say, European vendors might come through the NASPO vehicles, and NASPO would try to set up a structure to take the benefit of a federal exemption from tariffs. There are legal ways that could have been done, but with the failure of the Trump tariffs before the Supreme Court, those strategies have not been implemented.
But what I feel now from your saying is that actually the main aim to have tariffs was obviously to earn more money, but as you are saying, this didn't happen. Obviously, the market is suffering from this.
In the procurement realm, yes.
Yes, in procurement realm, yeah.
Yeah, I I think if you assume the goal of tariffs was to tax, to make money, I think you're missing the big picture. I think the big picture is that the purpose of tariffs was to create power for Trump, and that Trump can impose a tariff overnight, and suddenly billions of dollars of money are pouring in, and he can exert pressure both against domestic companies that want exemption from the tariffs and against foreign governments and foreign vendors. I think understanding them as a tax measure is a mistake. They should be understood as a power measure. They're not about taxes.
Thank you very much for this insight. Of course, we see many things differently here, but this is great that we can get like the real insight. Okay, would you have some last comments for our listeners?
I think that as the European Union is moving towards revising the procurement structure, whether or not it's through a new directive or through new regulation, it's a very exciting time for European procurement. And I think that we talked about this over the last few days. The American procurement system was actually founded from French procurement rules in the 1770s. So America has been borrowing from Europe since the 1770s. There are some lessons that can be learned by sharing, by communication across the Atlantic. I strongly encourage European procurement policymakers to look across the Atlantic, have those shared lessons in order to make a stronger European procurement system.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, very much. It was really very interesting to have this discussion with you. Thank you, dear listeners. You are listening to the podcast of Public Procurement Office with Petra Šupáková.
Podcast of the PPO. Podcast about everything from the world of public procurement.